Summer, 1941. Dust gritted between their teeth. A convoy of trucks, loaded with the wounded and the remnants of the battalion, funneled into a depression. The road narrowed between the slopes. 3 camouflaged German Panzer IIIs had the exit zeroed in. They held the high ground. Their main guns were methodically chewing up the head of the column. It was a point-blank kill zone. Shells shredded the wooden truck beds into splinters. Artillery horses thrashed in their harnesses, tangled in the traces. Shrapnel mowed down the infantry hugging the ruts. Men screamed, clawing at severed arteries. The ground soaked up blood and boiling gasoline. Thick black smoke choked the ravine. Lieutenant Makhmudov pressed himself against the rim of the hatch. The hull of the BT-7 fast tank shuddered from nearby impacts. The 12-cylinder aero engine roared at idle. Vibrations hammered through the steering levers into the driver's hands. The cramped fighting compartment was a furnace. It reeked of oil, sweat, and cordite. Makhmudov peered through the periscope. The triplex glass was a spiderweb of cracks from a stray round. The tactical situation outside allowed for only one conclusion. The German gunners were working with the cold precision of a firing range. First, they hammered the lead vehicles, pinning the convoy in place. Then, they cold-bloodedly shifted their fire to the rear. A kill box. Panicked infantry tried to scramble up the slopes. Machine gun bursts stitched across the berm, cutting them down. Corpses rolled down under the wheels of the burning trucks. Static hissed in the intercom. The driver's voice came through muffled, nearly drowned out by the mounting roar. "Commander, the lead truck is burning. The bridge is blocked. We're fucked." Makhmudov didn't pull his eye away from the sight. The rubber brow pad bit into his skin. "I see it. 3 more minutes and this whole column is scrap metal. Orders? Do we pull back?" "There is no back. Stand by." Makhmudov dryly counted the seconds between the German reports. 1, 2, 3. A flash on the ridge. Another truck disintegrated into a cloud of jagged metal. The enemy was methodical. They knew the 2 Soviet 45mm anti-tank guns had been knocked out in the opening seconds. Direct HE hits had vaporized the limbers and their ammo. There was nothing left to protect the dying convoy. Except for one light tank, tucked behind the smoking carcass of an artillery tractor. The Soviet armor was only good against small arms. The German 50mm rounds would punch through it like paper at any range. A static frontal engagement was suicide. Waiting meant death in minutes, as soon as the Germans finished with the trucks. The engine coughed out a plume of blue smoke. The loader slammed the breech of the 45mm main gun. A fixed round slid into the chamber. The breech block slammed home. Gun ready. But firing was useless. The German mediums were hull down behind earthworks. Only their turret faces were visible above the berms. Too small a target. Too much Krupp steel. Another shell impacted 30 feet from their cover. The shockwave slammed into the starboard side. The commander was thrown chest first against the breech. A high-pitched ringing filled his ears. Paint flakes and metal scale rained down from the ceiling. Makhmudov spat blood from a bitten lip. He pressed back into the optics. The ground between their cover and the German line was a moonscape of craters. A kill zone. Crossing it meant exposing their flanks to a 3-way crossfire. The famous Christie suspension wasn't a point of pride for a parade now. It was their only tool for survival. The machine's ability to hit top speed over broken ground was their only shot at clearing the gauntlet. If a road wheel dipped into a crater at low speed, the suspension wouldn't save them from a direct hit. Makhmudov scanned the terrain, meter by meter. His gaze locked onto an old anti-tank ditch. It cut a jagged line across the field, right in front of the enemy positions. A wide, sheer-sided trench. A distorted voice rasped in his headphones. "Comrade Lieutenant, the infantry are breaking from the ravine. They're going to get slaughtered." "Cut the panic. Await my command." Mahmudov lowered his binoculars. His face was a mask of tension, lips clamped shut. His brain was in overdrive, crunching numbers, gun elevation, max speed, and the exact distance to the ditch. A split-second error would end in an ammo cook-off. The thickness of the German frontal armor left them without a prayer in a head-on fight. He had to force them to expose their soft spots, force them out from behind those earthworks, play on their sense of invincibility. A heavy shell detonated outside with a deafening crack. A fragment shrieked as it gouged the metal of the track fender. Time was up. The column had ceased to exist as a unit. It was just a slurry of flesh and metal being churned by explosions. Mahmudov gripped the turret traverse handle. The cold metal bit into his sweaty palm. The decision was made. It flew in the face of every armored tactic in the manual. It meant almost certain death for the crew. But it was the only way to pull the German gunners off the trucks. "Driver, listen up!" The lieutenant's voice was flat. No tremor. The daily grind of war. Heavy labor requiring surgical precision. "Ready, Commander. Keep your foot on the clutch. On my mark, floor it. I want everything she's got. They'll light us up in the first 100 meters. It's a goddamn bowling alley out there." "They won't. Steer for the enemy tank on the far right." To the right, the turret of a destroyed armored car was tossed into the air with a roar. The ground beneath the tracks vibrated from dozens of impacts. The stench of charred meat from outside seeped through the smell of gasoline inside the tank. Mahmudov locked his gaze on the ambush. The Germans felt like they owned the place. Their breeches clanked with rhythmic precision. They weren't expecting a strike from below. The tank engine screamed as it hit max RPM, drowning out the cries of the infantry. The lieutenant's fingers found the firing switch. The clock was running. 2 Soviet 45mm anti-tank guns were smoldering on the shoulder. The charred remains of the crews were ground into the dirt. Direct hits from German HE had turned the guns into twisted scrap. The trail of one gun had punched through a truck's side. The wheels were smoking. The convoy was naked. The German gunners held perfect positions. 3 medium tanks sat hull down behind earthworks. Their hulls were safely tucked into the terrain. Only the turrets loomed over the berms. 50mm of Krupp armor steel, frontal aspect, perfect slope. Shrapnel drummed against the light tank's armor. The ringing merged into a continuous drone. Lieutenant Mahmudov peered through the sight. The crosshairs settled on the center tank's gray turret. 800 meters. A 45mm armor-piercing round would do nothing but leave a silver scratch on German armor at this range. Firing would give them away instantly. The return volley from 3 guns would shred their thin skin. A head-on duel meant they'd be scrap in 15 seconds. The engine coughed out exhaust. The driver white-knuckled the steering levers. The loader kept a sweat-slicked hand on the breech. The crew was frozen. The world had shrunk to the size of a periscope view. Another near miss threw a ton of earth against the starboard side. Clods of clay pelted the vision slit. The tank shuddered to its core. The welds groaned under the pressure. No time for deliberation. The seconds were bleeding out along with the infantry outside. Mahmudov's eyes were glued to the scratched optics. His brain tuned out the panic, focusing on the cold math of survival. Field of view, sector of fire, range. German turret traverse, 15 degrees per second. Enemy gunner reaction time, 3 seconds. Shell flight time, fractions of a second. Mahmudov cold-bloodedly mapped out the enemy's blind spots. His gaze swept the terrain below the German positions. 200 meters in front of the German tanks, a dark gash appeared. An old anti-tank ditch, dug a month ago by a retreating infantry battalion. A wide trench with vertical walls. An armor-piercing round punched through the tractor wreck Mahmudov was using for cover. The slug shrieked into the sky. A ricochet. A glowing piece of metal hissed inches from the turret. Their cover was gone. Safety was an illusion. The next shot would be a kill. The Germans had the range. The commander snapped out of it. The tactical math was finished. The ditch was the only piece of cover in the entire cratered field. But it was right under the muzzles of the enemy guns. The only way there was across open ground, under a hail of fire, under the sights of 3 cannons. Mahmudov keyed the intercom. "Driver, listen up. 600 meters to the ditch. I want max speed. Straight line." The driver's ragged breathing filled the headset. "Commander, that's a death sentence. Will be target practice. They got 50 mils of armor. Our gun won't touch their front. Why?" "Stow the chatter. Listen to the numbers. Their turrets are 50. Their belly armor is 15 millimeters. You copy? 15. The loader froze, clutching a 45 millimeter AP round. The clatter of the dying tractor's tracks outside drowned out thought. "We're dropping into that ditch." Mahmudov's voice was iron. "And we're hitting them from the bottom up, right under the belly plate." The plan violated every fundamental law of armored warfare. It required a suicidal dash across a kill zone. It required dropping a 13-ton machine into a deep trench at full tilt. 100% chance of flipping the tank. Maximum risk of the fuel tanks detonating on impact. But it was the only right move. The math of death left no other choice. Either burn here in 60 seconds, or gamble everything on one mathematically sound chance to hit a weak spot. An HE shell tore through the cab of a medical truck behind them. A wave of searing air blasted through the open engine louvers. The temperature in the fighting compartment spiked. The acrid stench of scorched insulation and human flesh hit their nostrils. "Load AP," the lieutenant commanded dryly. The loader slammed the heavy fixed round into the breech with one sharp motion. The metallic clank of the block, the click of the extractor. The gun was hot. The commander cinched his helmet tight. His hand settled naturally on the turret traverse handle. His eyes measured the distance to the jagged lip of the ditch. The enemy continued their methodical execution. To the left, a fuel tanker went up. A 30-meter pillar of fire roared into the sky. Orange light washed over the soot-stained faces of the tankers. Heat radiated through the armor. The hull was getting hot. Breathing became a chore. Mahmudov plotted their path. The ground ahead was chewed up. The suspension had to eat every rut. If a road wheel caught a deep hole, their speed would drop. A 5-click drop in speed meant another second in the crosshairs. 1 second meant 3 more German shells in their flank. The commander spoke the route into the mic, guiding the driver past the smoking craters. Math had no room for emotion, only precise figures, only millimeters and seconds. 600 meters separated life from oblivion. 12 seconds at full throttle across broken ground. 12 seconds under the aimed fire of 3 Krupp cannons. The engine screamed as it hit its peak. The roar of the cooling fans drowned out the artillery. The machine was ready to leap. Makhmudov's right hand hovered over the switch. The radio silence was deafening. "Driver, floor it!" The lieutenant's short command sliced through the stale air of the compartment. The main clutch pedal hit the floor. The driver yanked back on the heavy gear levers. The 12-cylinder aero engine exploded into a deafening roar. The RPM needle buried itself past the red line. The exhaust stacks spat out thick plumes of black smoke. The 13-ton war machine bolted from its cover. Steel tracks ground through brick rubble. The dash was on. The tractor wreck fell away behind them. The BT-7 hurtled into the open. A naked field churned up by heavy shells. The Christie Springs took the first brutal impact of a deep rut. The shocks bottomed out with a jarring metallic thud. The multi-ton hull was tossed into the air. The road wheels slammed back onto the scorched earth. The machine shuddered but kept accelerating. Speed climbed exponentially. 20, 40, 60. The appearance of a high-speed target instantly broke the German rhythm. The enemy commanders spotted the green box charging straight at them. Orders were barked. 3 German turrets swung in unison. The 50mm barrels abandoned the stationary convoy of wounded. Electric drives whined as they slewed the heavy turrets toward the flying target. The kill box had a new, rapidly moving focal point. The field ahead became a zone of total destruction. The earth erupted in massive black pillars right in front of the tank's nose. HE shells tore the ground to ribbons. Clods of wet clay and jagged shrapnel drummed against the sloped glacis plate. "Hold your course! Don't you dare swerve!" Makhmudov screamed into the intercom. The driver was white-knuckling the levers. His face was a mask of sweat and acrid soot. His eyes frantically picked out the outlines of deep craters through the thick dust. The speedometer needle bounced at 70 kilometers per hour, the absolute limit for a light tank on broken ground. Every time an idler wheel hit a crater, they risked throwing a track. Throwing a track at 70 meant an instant roll, a fuel explosion, and certain death. The German gunners cold-bloodedly calculated their lead. The first AP round tore through the air an inch from the rear armor plate. A blast of superheated air slammed into the radiator louvers. The engine choked on a strained howl as it pulled the tank out of the impact zone. A second later, a bright flash to the right. A direct hit slammed into the turret. An AP slug caught the right cheek of the Soviet tank at a glancing angle. Krupp steel bit into the armor. The metal let out a hideous shriek. A shower of blinding sparks sprayed in every direction. Massive kinetic energy buckled the side plate. The shell sheared off the external handrails and screamed off into a ricochet. Inside the cramped fighting compartment, the hydroshock was devastating. The sound of the impact blew past the pain threshold. Eardrums were driven inward. Compressed air hammered their lungs, knocking the wind out of them. Makhmudov was violently thrown back from the site. His tank helmet flew off his head. The loader collapsed onto the diamond plate floor with a muffled groan, dropping the heavy 45mm round. A ringing, dead silence filled his skull. The heavy concussion had completely severed his hearing. Makhmudov saw the loader's mouth hanging open in a silent scream as he clawed at his head. Red-hot metal scale rained down from the ceiling like a thick storm. Jagged shards of internal spalling, shrapnel from their own armor, slashed their faces and bare arms. The acrid stench of scorched oil paint and burnt cordite seared his throat. There was no air left to breathe. Makhmudov lunged forward, shoving his helmet back on. Thick, dark blood leaked from his nose, staining his chin and the collar of his salt-crusted tunic. He threw himself back toward the shattered triplex. The tank was still in its suicidal dash. The engine howled on a single high-pitched note. The driver had miraculously kept control after the massive dynamic shock. "Speed! Don't you drop that speed!" the commander rasped into the blood-slicked throat mic. The tank flew over the craters, 70 kilometers per hour. 13 tons of iron had become a single fired projectile. A near-miss HE burst sheared the left track fender clean off. A piece of mangled metal dragged along the ground with a roar, throwing sparks from the tensioned tracks. The German guns were firing without a moment's pause. Bright tracers etched glowing lines through the thick, dusty air. The distance to the enemy line was closing with terrifying speed. The enemy realized the Russian light tank wasn't trying to dodge. It was closing the distance head-on. A dark, jagged line emerged through the black smoke. The wide anti-tank ditch. The true objective of this charge. The sheer edges of the deep trench were rushing toward them with every fraction of a second. It was too late to brake. There was nowhere to turn. The German gunners calmly led the straight-charging machine into their Zeiss optics. The next volley was guaranteed to be the last. 500 meters. The distance evaporated in the roar of the 12-cylinder aero engine. Speed didn't slacken. The light tank hurtled toward 3 heavy guns. The German gunners instantly ceased fire on the broken convoy. 3 50-millimeter barrels dropped in unison. They hunted for the green target in their crosshairs. Electric drives hummed as they slewed the multi-ton Krupp steel turrets. The kill box had a new target. Scorched earth rose up like a wall ahead. A synchronized enemy volley tore the field apart. HE shells churned the earth directly in the Soviet machine's path. Black fountains of explosions merged into a solid barrier. The shockwave compressed the air into a solid wall. It was impossible to punch through that firestorm in a straight line. The driver slammed his weight into the left steering lever. His right foot mashed the brake pedal. The track locked with a piercing shriek. The 13-ton machine went into a controlled skid. The tank drifted sideways at 60 kilometers per hour. Wide steel tracks aggressively tore into the dry crust of the earth. The port side tilted dangerously. The starboard road wheels lifted off the ground. The metal of the spring suspension groaned under the impossible load. The trajectory broke at the very last split second. An AP slug pierced the void where the turret had been a heartbeat before. The slipstream from the flying red-hot metal whipped the whip antenna. "Oil's dropping! Pressure's at 0!" the driver screamed into the intercom, his voice cracking. "Keep the revs up! 400 meters!" Makhmudov's voice snapped like a pistol shot. The tank leveled out with a bone-jarring crash. The driver dumped the clutch. The motor choked, spat a cloud of thick black smoke from the exhaust, and screamed back to life at max RPM. A lunge forward. The suspension ate the hard landing. The machine's belly plate slammed against the edge of a fresh crater. The screech of deforming metal drowned out the artillery fire. Jagged German shrapnel fanned across the starboard side. The track fenders were sheared off at the root. Strips of mangled iron flew off with a clatter. The exposed track continued to churn the earth. There was no protection left. Any rock caught in the track now would snap the tensioned belt. 300 meters. Point-blank range. The enemy turrets traversed with cold precision. The German commanders had read the maneuver. They were no longer firing for effect, but leading the target with absolute accuracy. Barrels shifted a few degrees ahead of Makhmudov's course, calculating speed, waiting for the perfect moment. Inside the cramped fighting compartment,
The heat was unbearable. The blower couldn't keep up with the thick cordite fumes and the acrid stench of battle. Bitter smoke stung the eyes. The loader sat on the ribbed floor, his white-knuckled fingers gripping the breech handle. Blood from a shrapnel wound in his cheek dripped onto the canvas roll. He stared at the gun's breech.
A fixed round was chambered, but firing on the move was a guaranteed miss. "Idler's hit! The tracks are slipping!" the driver rasped. A monstrous vibration hammered through the steel levers, threatening to shatter his wrists. 250 meters! Dead ahead! The lieutenant barked into the mic. Makhmudov was glued to the sight, his eyes watering from the smoke. Cracks in the periscope glass distorted the battlefield. Ahead, a long, jagged line loomed black, an old anti-tank ditch. Meter by meter it widened, yawning into an abyss. A deep trench with sheer earthen walls, a death trap for any armor. The enemy pulled the trigger. A 50mm shell slammed into the dirt 10 meters left of the hull. Large fragments bit into the turret armor, the ring of the impact hammering their eardrums. Inside the tank, a rivet head snapped off with a sharp crack. Red-hot metal zipped through the commander's tunic sleeve. He ignored the wound. The pain would come later. Right now, only the closing distance existed. 200 meters! The commander counted down. The dry numbers fell like sledgehammer blows. The German tanks sat motionless on the high ground, transformed into static concrete bunkers. They watched the Soviet armored vehicle charging straight for the edge of the abyss, waiting coldly for the driver to slam on the brakes before the deadly drop. They waited for the tank to stop. A single second of stillness would be its last. 3 armor-piercing shells would punch straight through the glacis plate. The ground was vanishing rapidly beneath the tracks. Speed exceeded 60 kilometers per hour. There wasn't enough stopping distance left. The ditch filled the entire space ahead. A black maw opened wide. 150! Transmission's on fire! The driver screamed. Thick white smoke from the engine compartment crawled into the fighting compartment. 100 meters! Don't let up! The order hit like a backhand slap. The deafening clatter of the tracks merged into a solid roar as the machine hurtled toward the precipice. The enemy guns went still. German gunners locked their Zeiss crosshairs on the lip of the ditch, ready to execute the stationary target at point-blank range. The distance shrank to the physical limit. 50 meters. The shadow of the heavy German tanks fell across the shell-pocked earth. Enemy guns stared directly into the frontal armor. The black holes of the muzzles were visible. Massive muzzle brakes, weld seams on the matte gray armor. The lieutenant registered every detail. Time slowed down. The driver instinctively leaned back, his foot trembling over the brake pedal. The self-preservation reflex demanded he stop the machine. A sheer drop ahead. Certain death. "Floor it!" Makhmudov snarls. Blood bubbled on his lips. "Keep moving!" The engine howled in its death throes. Coolant temperature spiked past the red line. The smell of melting wiring seared their lungs. The light tank turned into a flaming, flying projectile. The final meters vanished under the tracks. The black rim of the ditch rushed to meet them. The enemy waited for the stop. The edge of the abyss approached with the inevitability of a fired shell. The distance had collapsed to 0. It was too late to brake. Any drop in speed before the sheer drop of the anti-tank ditch meant certain death. 3 German gunners held the green frontal armor tight in the crosshairs of their superb Zeiss optics. Their index fingers rested on the triggers. The vehicle stopping was the only signal they needed. Three 50mm armor-piercing shells would instantly tear 13 tons of Soviet steel to shreds. A straight jump was also out of the question. The geometry of the ditch dictated its own harsh laws. The tank's heavy nose would inevitably slam into the opposite wall of the trench, flipping the hull onto the turret. The monstrous impact would shear the gun from its trunnions. The 45mm shells stowed in the racks would detonate instantly. The crew would burn alive in an overturned steel box. Lieutenant Mahmudov knew this. His brain worked like an adding machine, cutting out fear and leaving only the raw numbers of distance and mass. The tactical plan rested on the razor-thin line between a controlled catastrophe and the physics of heavy machinery. "Left clutch back!" The harsh, emotionless command hit the eardrums through the intercom headsets. There was no doubt in it, only the cold calculation of a suicide run. The crew was ready to die. The driver acted on raw reflex, his survival instinct paralyzed. All his strength was poured into one sharp movement. With both hands, he yanked the heavy steel left-side steering lever. The linkages groaned under the strain. Inside the transmission compartment, an instantaneous mechanical reaction occurred. The wide brake band locked the rotating drum tight. The left track seized completely. Thousands of steel grousers bit into the packed earth, throwing off showers of sparks. But the right track continued to spin furiously. The 12-cylinder aircraft engine put out maximum torque. The machine was moving at 60 kilometers per hour, and the massive kinetic energy of 13 tons of metal could not simply vanish. The tank took a monstrous lateral hit from its own inertia. The hull was thrown into a violent, uncontrollable skid. The vector of motion broke. The machine swung sideways toward the edge of the abyss. The Christie suspension took on an extreme overload. The right side lifted threateningly off the ground, the heavy road wheels hanging in the air as the left shock absorber springs compressed to the limit. Metal shrieked from the friction. The earth under the locked left track instantly turned to dust, and a giant gray cloud hid the tank from enemy eyes. Inside the fighting compartment, the violent jolt hurled the crew against the inner armor plates. The commander slammed his chest into the steel gun breech, knocking the breath from his lungs. The loader fell onto the ribbed floor, frantically clutching a heavy fixed round to his chest to prevent the primer from hitting metal. Oil paint flaked off the walls from the vibration. At that moment, Mahmudov's main calculation paid off. A gamble on the psychology of the German tankers. In the enemy's sights, the perfect target suddenly lost control. The German commanders saw exactly what the logic of battle told them. A Russian driver panicking. A fatal mistake at the edge of the drop. They saw a tank that had spun into an uncontrollable skid and would now inevitably plunge to the bottom of the ditch, turning into a heap of mangled scrap. Pedantic German discipline took over. There was no tactical sense in wasting scarce armor-piercing shells on a target that was destroying itself. The tension broke. The enemy gunners instinctively pulled their hands away from the firing mechanisms. The gun barrels dipped slightly. The enemy decided to simply watch the Russian machine smash to pieces. The deadly illusion worked perfectly. The fire trap opened its jaws for exactly 1 second. That second was decisive. The skidding tank reached the edge of the earthen gap. The support under the locked left track suddenly vanished. The center of gravity shifted rapidly into the void. The heavy nose dipped down. The machine lost contact with the solid surface. The engine exploded with a deafening howl as the load on the drive shafts dropped instantly. Long tongues of orange flame erupted from the exhaust pipes. 13 tons of steel began a free fall into the abyss.
Inside the red-hot fighting compartment, a brief moment of weightlessness set in. Dust, bits of scale, and spent machine gun casings lifted off the floor, hovering in the thick cordite-saturated air. Drops of blood from the commander's battered face floated in space. The sounds of the cannonade vanished. All that remained was the frantic whine of the idling engine and the whistle of rushing air. The bottom of the wide ditch rushed to meet them. Sheer clay walls flickered in the shattered vision slits. The tank fell at a critical angle. The right track, still spinning wildly in the air, caught the crumbling edge of the drop. The enormous mass of the falling hull yanked the steel band tight on the drive sprocket. The track pins let out a piercing screech as the metal began to groan unbearably under the monstrous pressure. The track was about to snap. The impact with the bottom was inevitable. The massive risk of overturning and the fuel tanks detonating loomed over the crew. Makhmudov gripped the gun-laying handles tight and stared into the sight. The fall continued. 13 tons of Soviet steel crashed onto the bottom of the deep anti-tank ditch. The monstrous impact crumpled the floor metal without mercy. The Christie suspension springs bottomed out, and the swing arms slammed into the steel bump stops with a savage screech. The vehicle's hull was jerked into the air and slammed violently onto its right side. The dynamic jolt ripped the men from their seats. Lieutenant Makhmudov's helmeted head thudded against the gun breech. The right track couldn't withstand the extreme tension. The track pins snapped with a shearing ring. The broken band flew off the idler wheel, lashed against the remains of the fender, and slid into the viscous clay like a useless piece of iron. The tank buried its nose in the dirt, tilted, and came to a halt at a sharp angle. The engine choked in a thick cloud of kicked-up dust, spat out blue smoke, and died. A ringing silence followed. The deadly illusion was complete. The trap was set. Inside the cramped fighting compartment, a thick haze of dust hung in the air, smelling of ruptured oil lines, overheated metal, and raw earth. Makhmudov unclenched his jaw and spat a dark glob of blood onto the ribbed floor. He pressed his face hard against the rubber eyepiece of the sight. The periscope was aimed straight up at the jagged edge of the drop, the optical crosshairs frozen against the gray sky. Now, only the enemy's psychology was at work. The German commander of the center vehicle had seen the uncontrolled fall. The logic of battle told him the light tank had smashed into the bottom, that the crew was guaranteed dead or severely concussed. But rigid German pedantry demanded visual confirmation of the kill. It demanded they move in close and deliver a coup de grace with an armor-piercing shell into the thin roof of the engine compartment. A smart enemy doesn't leave wounded prey behind. Makhmudov knew this with absolute clarity. He waited. The seconds of silence stretched like thick molasses. Blood drummed the rhythm of his pulse in his temples. Above, a low, vibrating hum grew. The earth around the crater began to tremble. Dry clumps of clay crumbled from the sheer walls of the ditch, drumming against the sloped armor. The enemy had swallowed the bait. A multi-ton machine crawled straight toward the edge of the abyss. The sound of the wide tracks became deafening, filling the space of the pit. A square shadow appeared in Makhmudov's sight, slowly blocking out the light. A matte frontal armor plate crawled heavily onto the edge of the earthen ditch. Behind it, the drive sprockets appeared. The German driver inched the machine forward with extreme caution, wanting to peer into the bottom of the trench. The enemy tank's center of gravity shifted inexorably past the point of support. The multi-ton steel hull tipped over the fragile clay edge.
The nose dipped sharply under its own weight. The 50mm gun lowered along with the hull, searching for the wrecked target. This involuntary nod became the enemy's fatal mistake. The tilt of the hull revealed what is always safely hidden behind earthen berms, terrain folds, and thick frontal plates. In Makhmudov's crosshairs, the most vulnerable underbelly of the armored beast appeared. The smooth floor plate. Only 15mm of structural steel. No rational slope angles, no extra plating. A perfectly flat projection from a distance of exactly 15 meters. Pistol shot range. A perfect target for the 45mm Soviet gun. The barrel was looking straight up. "AP ready," the loader rasps dryly. He wiped blood from his battered face with his tunic sleeve, his left hand resting on the gun guard. No panic, only the automation of a professional. Makhmudov didn't answer. His index finger firmly squeezed the trigger. The firing pin struck the primer of the fixed round with a dry click. The fighting compartment was instantly lit by a short yellow flash. The brutal recoil of the gun threw the smoking barrel back with a deafening clang. The metal extractor spat the spent casing onto the scale-covered floor with a ring. The armor-piercing slug punched through 15 meters of empty air in imperceptible fractions of a second. The shell hit exactly under the edge of the tilted vehicle's hull. 15mm of thin belly armor offered the slug no resistance. The steel tip smashed through the lower plate with a sickening crunch. The armor-piercing shell burst right into the enemy's fighting compartment. Inside the cramped space, packed to the brim with ammunition, the massive kinetic energy converted to heat. A spray of white-hot internal armor fragments fanned out, shredding the crew. The slug punched straight through the HE shell racks, and fire engulfed the exposed powder charges. The chain detonation of the ammo rack was instantaneous. A monstrous internal explosion tore the German machine apart. A blinding fireball erupted from all open hatches with a roar. A dense shockwave slammed downward, crushing the mangled Soviet tank even deeper into the clay bottom. Roaring flames licked the barrel of Makhmudov's gun. The enemy tank's turret was ripped from its ring. The multi-ton construction of thick steel was blown far back with a horrific crash, flipping heavily in the air. The deafening crack of the exploding ammo completely drowned out the screams of the burning men. The enemy medium tank turned into a blazing torch, right on the edge of the drop. Black, oily smoke choked the sky over the hollow. The first armored target was completely destroyed. The shockwave ripped through the dense air of the hollow. The monstrous ammo cook-off tore the first enemy machine apart from the inside. A blinding flash seared the oxygen at the edge of the abyss. The multi-ton steel turret was sheared from its ring with a vile screech. The pressure of the powder gases hurled the heavy structure high into the grey sky. Red-hot chunks of mangled metal whistled in every direction. Heavy armor fragments crashed to the ground, punching deep craters into the dry soil. The blazing hulk settled on the very edge of the drop. Black, oily smoke instantly blanketed the horizon. Burning gasoline cascaded down the sheer clay walls of the trench. The crews of the two remaining German tanks lost their tactical orientation. The fire sac was breached. The perfect mathematics of the ambush crumbled in a single second. The German commanders fell into a dull stupor, their brains refusing to process the incoming information. A minute ago, they were coldly gunning down a defenseless column. A second ago, they saw a Soviet light tank plunge at full speed into the bottom of an anti-tank ditch. The target had guaranteed its own destruction. The logic of battle was broken. From a dead pit, from the bottom of an earthen grave, A 45mm armor-piercing shell had flown out. The enemy didn't understand the physics of what had happened. They were blinded by the close explosion of their own machine. They could not see the shooter. Panic instantly shattered the measured rhythm of the German attack. Fear of an invisible threat paralyzed cold calculation. The driver of the second tank made a fatal mistake. The animal instinct for self-preservation overpowered years of drilled tactical training. He didn't stay put. He didn't search for the target through the smoke. He frantically yanked the heavy transmission control levers, trying to immediately bug out of the kill zone. His right foot slammed the gas pedal down. The powerful Maybach engine screamed at max RPM. Heavy, wide tracks churned the dry earth furiously as the tank reversed in a panic. The machine made an uncontrolled, jerky lurch. The tracks slipped on the raw clay, and the hull swung into a deep, diagonal skid. This action signed the crew's death warrant. 30 millimeters of side armor emerged from the reliable protection of the earthen berm. The gray flank with its crisp white cross was fully exposed. A perfect rectangular target slid into the open. The distance closed to 30 meters. The most vulnerable spot of the enemy armored vehicle was completely bared. The steel trap snapped shut a second time. At the bottom of the trench, there was no room for panic. Inside the listing Soviet tank, the heat was suffocating. The air had been completely scorched by the previous shot. The blower's screeches as it cycled, acrid cordite smoke through the compartment. There was nothing to breathe. Oxygen deprivation hammered at their temples like a heavy mallet. The loader worked like a damaged but unstoppable clockwork mechanism. Thick blood from a deep gash on his forehead continuously flooded his right eye, a red veil clouding his vision. He roughly wiped the hot blood away with the grimy sleeve of his salt-stained tunic. The skin on his cheekbone was rubbed raw to the meat. The pain was ignored. His movements were honed to absolute automation. His left hand gripped the cold brass of the casing tight. His back muscles strained to the limit. The heavy 45mm fixed round was laid onto the loading tray. A sharp, merciless shove with the palm, and the armor-piercing slug slid into the heated breech with a metallic clang. The breech block slammed up with a dry, snapping crack. The casing was locked tight. The gun was cocked and ready. Lieutenant Mahmudov didn't pull his scarred face away from the rubber eyepiece. He didn't blink. His eye greedily caught a gray patch through the thick veil of black smoke. The silhouette of the second German tank filled the sight. The crosshairs settled exactly under the fender, right where 30 millimeters of Krupp steel hid the overfilled fuel tanks. The enemy tried to correct the mistake. The heavy turret began to traverse, the long 50mm gun barrel frantically searching for the target at the bottom of the ditch. The electric drive hummed under the strain. The enemy gunner took a blind lead. 2 more seconds, and he would fire blindly into the pit, burying the Soviet machine under tons of earth. No time left. The commander's index finger squeezes the trigger. The firing pin slams into the primer. A short, blinding yellow flash illuminates the soot-stained faces of the tankers. Violent recoil hammers the gun barrel back. The recoil buffers groan under the strain. The massive breech block thunders past the loader's shoulder, missing him by a hair. The automatic extractor spits the red-hot, smoking casing onto the floor with a metallic ring, adding to the litter of steel scale. The fighting compartment instantly fills with another suffocating wave of propellant gases. The AP round slices through the thick smoke. The steel slug covers the 30-meter distance in an imperceptible fraction of a second.
A dull thud hammers the crew's eardrums through the frontal armor. The pointed steel tears into the side plate of the German tank with a savage shriek. The armor is punched clean through. The metal snaps along a perfect weld seam with a sickening crunch. The shell erupts into the fighting compartment.
Kinetic energy shreds the thin engine bulkhead. The white-hot slug slams directly into a full fuel tank. Hydrostatic shock ruptures the steel walls from the inside out. Hundreds of liters of fuel instantly atomize into a fine mist. A stray spark from the breached armor ignites the concentrated vapors. The multi-ton enemy machine shudders from a monstrous internal explosion. A deafening boom drowns out the sounds of battle. Roaring flames instantly blow out every turret hatch. A pillar of fire surges 30 feet into the air, searing through the smokescreen. A shower of sparks and white-hot fragments of internal equipment spray outward, littering the scorched earth. The second German tank grinds to a dead halt. The wide tracks stop churning. The main gun sags limply. The machine transforms into a roaring steel crematorium. The enemy crew is wiped out in a split second. Ruthless punishment for a single mistake is carried out. 2 heavy tanks burned out from an utterly disadvantaged position at the bottom of a ditch. The trap has reaped its harvest, but the fight goes on. The third enemy is adapting. 2 blazing pyres illuminate the cratered field. Ragged flakes of black, oily smoke rise into the gray sky, blotting out the sun. The crew of the third German tank watches the instantaneous death of their comrades. A perfectly planned ambush has turned into a bloodbath. 2 heavy war machines turned into roaring crematoriums in seconds. But the experienced enemy doesn't succumb to primal panic. The German war machine is famous for its iron discipline. The commander of the surviving tank coldly analyzes the shifting situation. He instantly reads the geometry of the engagement. 2 of his comrades were destroyed by precision strikes to the thin belly and lower side hull. The hits came from point-blank range, from the bottom up, from the dead zone. The enemy officer makes the only correct tactical decision. He kicks the driver hard in the shoulder with his jackboot. A short order to halt rings out. The heavy machine grinds to a dead stop. The tracks lock with a metallic clang 50 meters from the edge of the embankment. The third tank won't go to the edge. It won't repeat the mistake of its predecessors. It won't expose its 15mm belly to the shot of an invisible gun. The German gunner calmly calculates the trajectory of the Soviet AP rounds. He visually traces a line from the burning wrecks to the suspected point at the bottom of the trench. The Soviet machine's position is pinpointed. The electric drive slews the heavy Krupp steel turret with a low hum. The long-barreled 50mm gun lowers like a predator. The target isn't the Soviet tank itself. It is invisible behind the sheer walls. The target is the overhanging lip of the anti-tank ditch directly above the calculated ambush position. With a practiced motion, the loader rams an HE shell into the breach. The firing pin strikes the primer with a dry click. The gun spits a plume of orange fire. The HE shell screams through the hollow. The heavy round slams precisely into the earthen ledge above the Soviet armor lying on its side. The fuse triggers instantly. A monstrous explosion rips through the packed soil. The shockwave shatters the structural integrity of the sheer wall. A dull roar fills the space. Gravity finishes the artillery's work. A massive slab of earth tears away from the trench edge. Dozens of tons of heavy clay, mixed with sharp stones, collapse into the bottom of the ditch. A giant, lethal landslide crashes directly onto the thin armor of the BT-7 light tank. The impact of the colossal mass of earth hammers the machine from above.
The sound of buckling metal drowns out the din of battle. The Christie suspension springs snap with a screech. The hull is driven deep into the viscous floor. The 15 millimeters of armored turret roof cannot withstand the extreme pressure. The sheet metal crumples inward with a piercing shriek. Weld seams burst.
The armor bows, ruthlessly shrinking the living space of the fighting compartment. The Soviet fast tank turns into a steel coffin, buried deep under a thick layer of earth. Absolute, dense darkness falls inside the mangled tank. The light bulbs shatter. The sharp pressure drop hammers the eardrums. The air is compressed. Dozens of tons of earth seal off every gap and vent. The machine's life cycle is cut short. Breathing becomes physically painful. The remaining oxygen burns away rapidly. The acrid smell of spilled motor oil mixes with suffocating soot. The severed intercom wiring sparks briefly in the gloom and begins to smolder. Toxic smoke from melting insulation quickly fills the cramped capsule. Every gasping breath sears the throat with fire. Lungs contract painfully, trying to claw the last bits of oxygen from the scorching darkness. The feeling of being buried alive paralyzes the nervous system. The unbearable weight of the collapsed steel ceiling presses down on shoulders, pinning every movement. The gunner lies on the floor littered with casings. A bent piece of armor plating has pinned his legs to the ribbed metal. A severe concussion blends with deep, traumatic shock. Broken ribs pierce his lungs with every attempt to breathe. Hot blood floods his face. In the pitch black, a short, strangled groan escapes him. That raspy sound of agony is drowned out by the hiss of melting insulation. Lieutenant Makhmudov cannot move. The earth has squeezed the box tight from all sides. The machine is immobilized. The aircraft engine has gone silent forever. Clamped in a steel vise, the commander tastes blood on his lips. His brain registers critical damage. The tank is dead. But through the pain and suffocation, the commander's fingers feel the cold metal of the traverse handles. He slowly pulls the elevation handwheel toward him. The mechanism turns with a strained screech. A beam of daylight pierces through the thick, damp earth. The 45mm gun barrel isn't broken. It escaped the direct impact of the collapsing mass. The black steel tube of the gun pokes stubbornly out of the clay pile. It still looks out over the jagged edge of the anti-tank ditch. The steel trap is buried in earth, but its jaws can still snap shut. The dying crew prepares to deliver one last blow. The death grip of the buried machine breaks bones. The oxygen is completely burned out. Every convulsive breath tears the lungs from the inside. The darkness of the fighting compartment presses down with leaden weight. Lieutenant Makhmudov struggles to open eyelids, glued shut by thick blood. The gunner wheezes hoarsely on the floor beneath the warped armor plate. His legs are pinned tight by the dislodged ammo rack. The loader shows no signs of life. A heavy shard of internal lining pierced his chest when the ceiling collapsed. 12 tons of raw earth have turned the light tank into a cramped mass grave. The gun survived by a miracle. The 45mm barrel sticks stubbornly out from under the earthen mound. The commander takes the sights himself. His back muscles cramp with unbearable pain. A shattered collarbone shoots fire with every movement of his hand. Makhmudov coldly ignores the destruction of his own body. His right palm rests firmly on the cold elevation wheel. His left hand fumbles for the stiff trigger. The window of the shattered vision block offers only a narrow strip of murky light. a small piece of grey sky above the jagged edge of the anti-tank ditch. This is the only world left to the dying crew. The earth overhead begins to vibrate faintly. Dry dust trickles through cracks in the mangled armor. The vibration rapidly swells into a heavy, rhythmic thrum. The third enemy hasn't left. The German commander proved smart, but his meticulous nature demands absolute certainty. He must personally verify the total destruction of the buried target. Heavy tracks aggressively grind the soil, slowly approaching the edge of the drop. The enemy driver operates with maximum caution. The low thrum of the 12-cylinder Maybach engine rises. Death crawls methodically toward the buried Soviet tank. The light in the vision block suddenly fails. A giant square shadow falls over the buried pit. The silhouette of the third German tank completely blots out the sky. The multi-ton steel carcass looms over the very edge. The enemy 50mm gun lowers slowly, predatory, searching for vulnerable gaps in the earthen mound. The German gunners prepare a finishing shot with a heavy HE shell directly into the center of the pile. The distance has closed to 10 meters, point-blank range. Makhmudov doesn't breathe. Hot blood floods his left eye, but he cannot take his hand off the traverse mechanisms to wipe it away. He waits. Penetrating the enemy machine's thick frontal armor from this angle is impossible. An AP round would simply ricochet off the thick Krupp steel. He needs a vulnerability. He needs to force relentless physics to work against the armored monster. The enemy machine makes another short, jerky lurch forward. The wide steel tracks roll over an uneven patch of ground, crushing a massive clod of baked clay thrown up by the explosion. The tank's mass heaves heavily over the obstacle. The heavy nose of the machine tilts upward for a fraction of a second. The front suspension springs compress to their limit. This millimeter shift of the hull exposes the target. The lower glacis plate. A narrow strip of armor hiding the bulky transmission and the driver's compartment. The angle of incidence shifts sharply, turning the invulnerable front into an open target for a shot from below. Makhmudov understands clearly. This is a one-way ticket. Firing from a completely buried gun will trigger a monstrous shockwave inside the sealed space. The gun's recoil will inevitably crush what's left of the living crew. Toxic propellant fumes will instantly kill anyone still trying to breathe. The tactical calculation is complete. The price of the breakthrough has been paid in full. The Soviet commander's dry, cracked lips part. His voice is extremely quiet, without the slightest tremor. A cold statement of fact. Goodbye, brothers. His finger squeezes the steel trigger. The primer of the fixed round explodes. The gun, trapped in its earthen pocket, spits out the AP shell. A violent recoil strikes with incredible force. The barrel slams back, shearing off stops and shattering mechanisms. The monstrous pressure of the white-hot propellant gases ruptures the breach. The interior of the wrecked tank instantly fills with lethal fire and jagged shards of metal. The crew meets death in that same second. The 45mm AP round punches through 30 feet of dense air. The pointed steel bites into the German tank's lower glacis with a horrific crunch. The armor bursts from the direct hit. The slug screams into the driver's compartment. Massive kinetic energy shreds the bulky transmission to pieces. A fan of white-hot fragments scythes through the enemy driver and radio operator. Shards of metal ricochet off the internal armor walls, turning the fighting compartment into a slaughterhouse. The German tank shudders from a powerful internal hydrostatic shock. The engine instantly chokes and dies. Thick, oily black smoke pours from the open turret hatches with a rising roar. The enemy tank vomits flames. Uncontrolled fire quickly reaches the ammo racks. The third and final war machine of the ambush is turned into a dead hunk of iron forever. The fire trap is finally broken. The roar of the explosion echoes repeatedly through the narrow hollow. Suffocating smoke blankets the site of the clash, and then comes a second of ringing, surreal silence. The ambush is dead. The death trap is broken. The road is open. That silence is suddenly shattered by the strained wail of dozens of starters. The engines of the surviving Soviet trucks roar to life one by one. Drivers stomp on the gas pedals. Rubber tires tear at the blood-soaked earth with a piercing screech. The cratered hollow immediately surges into motion. The pinned-down infantry rises from the mud churned with blood. With hoarse cries, the soldiers surge into the open corridor. They run in a dense crowd, quickly flowing around the burning husks of enemy armor. A living river of desperate people and overloaded trucks rushes into the breached passage. The deadly ring of encirclement is broken. The rescued column picks up maximum speed, leaving the site of the horrific slaughter behind forever. The trucks pull away. The heavy rubber tires of the vehicles crush spent brass casings into the bloody mud with a sickening crunch. Worn-out engines howl in low gear. The column stretches out of the deadly hollow, meter by meter. The infantry marches in a silent, solid gray mass. Soldiers heavily drag their battered feet. Their faces are coated in a thick layer of dust and black soot. No one looks back. No one looks at the smoking wrecks on the edges of the anti-tank ditch. Survival today is only a brief reprieve before tomorrow's battle. Filthy boots churn earth mixed with hot motor oil and ash. The ragged drone of engines gradually fades into the still air. The tracks of dozens of tires are pressed deep into the soil. Life drains from this ravaged place, along with the rescued people. Hearts beat. Lungs greedily inhale air clearing of cordite. The column gains speed. The rescued battalion heads east. The fire pocket is torn open. Life continues thanks to a mathematically precise exchange of flesh and metal. The noise of the retreating equipment fades behind the crest of the hill. A dense, heavy silence descends on the field, cratered by heavy HE shells. This silence physically presses on the eardrums after the deafening roar of the tank duel. The wind lazily blows away the acrid, oily smoke. The battle space freezes. Only the dry ticking of cooling iron is heard. The mangled armor plates of the 3 German medium machines slowly contract under the dull sky. The white-hot Krupp steel makes sharp, clicking sounds. The thick 50mm frontal armor did not save the enemy crews from total annihilation. The magnificent optics melted and dripped in murky beads into the fire of the detonating ammunition. The rigid German tactical doctrine shattered against the cold calculation of a suicidal gambit. 3 heavy war machines have turned into useless heaps of blackened scrap. A turret weighing several tons, torn off by an internal explosion, is half buried in the loose soil. Nearby lie mangled road wheels and pieces of torn-off fenders. The smell of burnt gasoline, melted rubber, and charred paint is seared into the earth. The battlefield becomes a static monument to the cruel geometry of war, a monument to a mathematical inequality that was broken by the human factor. At the bottom of the deep earthen drop lies the dead Soviet machine, ABT-7 Fast Light Tank. 13 tons of mangled structural steel, completely buried by a multi-ton landslide of raw clay. The machine is frozen at an unnatural, broken angle. The thin 15mm turret armor is ruthlessly crushed by the colossal weight of the collapsed Earth. The famous Christie spring suspension is beyond repair, destroyed by the dynamic impact. Torn track links slide like steel snakes from the mangled road wheels and sink to the bottom of the trench. The 12-cylinder aircraft engine has gone silent forever. Only the blackened, deeply scarred barrel of the 45mm gun pokes out from under the massive earthen mound. The barrel looks stubbornly over the jagged edge of the ditch. It is completely empty. The breech is ruptured by an internal explosion. The last AP round hit its mark. The deadly mechanism gave its last measure of service. The crew is dead. Inside the flattened fighting compartment, there isn't a single sign of life. Not a single cubic centimeter of oxygen remains. Toxic smoke from burnt wiring has settled in a thick layer over the deformed instruments. Lieutenant Makhmudov, the nameless driver, and the wounded loader remain at their battle stations forever. Their broken bodies are pinned tight by dislodged internal components and buckled armor bulkheads. Blood congeals on the cold, ribbed metal of the floor. They didn't scream before they died. They didn't have time to feel paralyzing fear. They were doing a hard, dirty job. They turned hand wheels, yanked stiff levers, and rammed fixed rounds into the breech until the very last millisecond of their existence. Their grim tactical calculation wasn't built on blind luck or hope for rescue. Their plan relied solely on the dry figures of range, reload time, and precise knowledge of the thickness of the vulnerable enemy belly. The light machine went up against a manifold superiority in firepower. One light gun against 3 heavy cannons. Bulletproof armor against AP shells. By all the laws of tactics, this battle should have ended in 30 seconds with the total destruction of the Soviet tank in the open. But the will of professionals intervened in the formula. War does not tolerate empty words. It demands concrete actions and maximum payment for every meter won. The crew of the light tank coldly weighed the odds and threw their lives onto the scales. The perfectly calibrated geometry of the suicidal maneuver broke the mechanics of the German execution. The tankers turned their own mass grave into a perfect firing point. The cold will of 3 men locked in a buried box surpassed the overwhelming thickness of the enemy's armor. At the bottom of the dead trench, the mangled tank quietly burns out. The order has been carried out.